Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. I'm Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist based at Queen's University in Canada. And in this video today, I'm going to continue in the long series of lecture videos I've been posting on my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. I'm now going to turn to chapter 10 with the provocative title, What About a Good Death? Certainly a topic worthy of addressing for my book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. And as in previous videos, I'm just going to give a summary of some of the themes and main argumentation that I deploy in the book. This is the first video, and I'm going to reiterate a point I made before, that there are constraints on the ideals of longevity science. One of those constraints is a concern for a good life. While people want to survive and survive in a healthier state, they also want to live lives of meaning and purpose and balance the various commitments they have. And so wisdom, inquiry, longevity science must be constrained by a concern for a good life, but it also has to give some attention to a concern for a good death. And this has really profound implications, in particular, on the war against disease versus the ideal of rate control. And it reinforces my central conclusion that we should be investing more of our time, energy, and resources into the aspiration of rate control rather than disease control in contexts where populations are surviving beyond the seventh decade of life. I will also make a follow-up video to this where I detail more specifically how rate control can actually help us realize the aspirations of a good death. But in the first one, I'm going to be emphasizing the constraints of a good death on ideals of longevity science, and this is a particular problem for the ideal of disease control. All right, so I asked AI to generate an image of three of my favorite philosophers, Socrates on the deathbed and Plato and Aristotle there. So what is a good death? Really profound question, and one, while we're younger, we perhaps do not give much thought to unless we observe the passing of a loved one or family member, such as a grandparent. But as we go through the lifespan, it's something that begins to preoccupy some of our thoughts, making plans for what will happen to our family and loved ones after we pass or in the final stages of the lifespan. And my broad stance on this question, like it is on the issue of what constitutes a good life, is one of agnosticism. That is, I don't aspire in this particular book to provide a definitive answer to the question of what constitutes a good life. Right? So I have the shoulder shrug image there. However, I do believe that there are clear things that contravene whatever a kind of reasonable pluralistic account of the good life, of a good death is. Namely, that on no reasonable articulation of a good death would people hope to increase the duration of life where they are managing the multimorbidities, frailty, and disability of advanced age that prolongs suffering and erodes their emotional well-being. So even though I'm being agnostic on the specifics of what a good death is, that does not mean I am not going to be advancing some argumentation that has a substantive impact on what the ideals of medical science should be in an aging world. Okay, so as I noted, I'm not going to advance a specific account of a good death. Instead, so this is what I'm going to offer as an alternative, I'm going to argue that a concern for a good death imposes constraints on the ideal of wisdom, inquiry, science, especially for the ideal of disease control. Rate control, if it can make good on the promise of compressing morbidity, frailty, and disability in late life, is an ideal that can help the world's aging populations better realize a good death by shrinking the health span lifespan gap. So there's kind of a two-pronged point to that conclusion. The first one is that disease control, in particular, threatens the ideal of the realization of a good death because it seeks to maximize survival time. Whereas, which I'll cover in the second video, the idea of disease control, because it aspires to increase health span and compress morbidity in late life, it is much more likely to be conducive to the realization of a good death because it shrinks the period of time we are managing the comorbidities of advanced age and all of the detrimental effects that can come from the nearly 10-year disparity between health span and lifespan in the world today. All right, so I am interested in what the main accounts of a good death are, and I draw in particular, there's a couple of different sources I draw, and I've just plucked out one here from the American Journal of Geriatric Psychiatry. The article is Defining a Good Death or Successful Dying, a literature review, and a call for research and public dialogue. So I'm going to just highlight the 11 core themes that this literature review identified as being among the things that people identify as really important in the final stage of their life. And those things are like a preference for a specific dying process, pain-free status, a sense of dignity, religiosity and spirituality is important, family, one's emotional well-being, obviously their quality of life, life completion, right? A sense that you've achieved the things that you hope to achieve, treatment preferences, relationship with the healthcare provider, and some other factor. So I'm going to use this kind of as a general rubric, even though I'm going to be somewhat agnostic about the specifics of what constitute a good death, or at least pluralistic. I believe that if we pluck some of these central features of a good death and analyze how the ideals of disease control and rate control affect these things in the final stages of life, we'll see that there are good reasons for steering the steamship of modern public health towards the ideal of rate control rather than continuing down the myopic trajectory of trying to eradicate all diseases by delaying mortality into later life and exacerbating the health span lifespan gap further than the already 9.6-year gap that exists. In particular, I think a concern for a good death is a real problem for the war against disease. It was not something that was thought through in the initial stage of theorizing about the aspirations of public health in the early 20th century public health pioneers like Charles Winslow. So I have a video I already posted on chapter 5 where I talk about Winslow's candle analogy. And I'm just going to repeat very briefly the point of the candle analogy, just to show that when Winslow was problem solving the public health predicaments of the early 20th century, he was primarily and exclusively concerned with preventing early life mortality and had little comprehension of the complexity of issues that lay in store for the world's aging populations that would occur a century later. So he draws an analogy with a flame where he says at first the flame catches and it flutters feebly so that the least breath will quench it. So that's, early in life as infants and young children, we're very vulnerable to infectious disease mortality. And also, again, at the end of the lifespan, when it's burned almost to the socket, it flitters and easily goes out. Now, he goes on to say that the body in midlife can bear the most severe shocks of sickness and privation, but in infancy and old age, it succumbs to slightly unfavorable conditions. And in particular, this is the passage, the highlighted part of the passage, the extinction of life at the end of its natural cycle, after the course has been finished and the allotted work done, can scarcely be regretted. Right? So the implication is that as long as we prevent and delay mortality in youth and in midlife, we push it into later ages, and then people peacefully pass away in their sleep, and there's no, really tragic or unjust circumstances. They've lived a full life. But what Winslow could not anticipate, writing in the early 20th century, was the growing disparity between healthspan and lifespan. That his war against disease would actually get so successful at pushing death into later ages that there would be a growing disparity, a increase in the duration of time people are managing the comorbidities, frailty, and disability of late life. And so there are unfortunate circumstances that arise in the end of life. And one of the things that the continued war against disease jeopardizes is the realization of a good death. So as I've noted in previous videos, there is a growing disparity between lifespan and health span. That is, how long people will remain in reasonably good health, free of the diseases, frailty, and disability associated with advanced age, and how long they survive. And this is growing. It's nearly a decade. It's nearly 2.5 years longer for women who survive longer than men, but with poorer health. And I want to suggest that this disparity between health span and lifespan jeopardizes the realization of a good life, of a good death, as well as a good life, even if one is somewhat agnostic or pluralistic about what constitutes a good death. There's no scenario where one is going to be arguing that growing this disparity is going to help us realize a good death. So in particular, of those 11 factors noted earlier, I would say that the growing disparity between health span and lifespan are compromising quality of life, pain-free status, and our emotional well-being, 3 of the central ingredients that people typically identify as being important in a good death. And so there are real reasons for constraining the aspiration to delay mortality into later life. We're going to see in the next video, I argue that we can redress some of these concerns by facilitating a greater investment towards healthy longevity, because the longest lived, healthiest humans have a compression of morbidity in late life. But to fixate solely on trying to delay mortality into later stages of life by trying to conquer every disease, unfortunately, a unintended consequence of that is the erosion of the realization of a good death. So a good death for aging populations, I have the antlers of the deer hitting each other. These are in conflict. The war against disease does not come into conflict with a good death when the highest rates of mortality are in early life, but as they've been redistributed into later and later stages, namely, mid-70s and beyond, they then begin to come into conflict with the aspirations of a good death. Simply delaying mortality into later ages is incompatible with a good death because it is exacerbating the health span lifespan gap and eroding the realization of the things that people typically identify as being important to them for a good death. And so the take-home message of this for me, I have this juxtaposition between the war against disease, which we envision to be just all snow angels. There's no negative societal implications of waging wars against disease, but I have already shown that there are unintended consequences that are not things that we want to be realized, such as the onset of more debilitating, the higher prevalence of more debilitating conditions, such as Alzheimer's disease, versus switching more of our resources, time, and energy to targeting biological aging to increase health span. And I want to suggest that actually rate control is much more compatible with the realization of a good death than is the ideal of disease control. An unintended consequence, well, the war against disease was set up to pursue morally laudable aspirations, namely to save the lives of the young from infectious disease mortality and poverty, The domino effect of that, when we fast forward 100 years, and now we've gone from a life expectancy below 40 to one surpassing age 70, we see the large domino of the growing disparity between health span and lifespan, which is about 12.4 years in the United States. And that is the thing that will jeopardize both the realization of a good life and the realization of a good death. Now, in this chapter, I detail a couple of different suggestions that bioethicists have taken, and I'll just briefly mention one here from a very provocative essay by a very accomplished bioethicist, Ezekiel Emanuel. Why I Hope to Die at Age 75, a very provocative title, and one that generated a lot of discussion and debate at the time. It's a bit more than 10 years old in the Atlantic. And I'll just give a little sense of what Emanuel argues. This is a passage from him. Here is a simple truth that many of us seem to resist. Living too long is also a loss. It renders many of us, if not disabled, then faltering and declining, a state that may not be worse than death, but is nonetheless deprived. It robs us of our creativity and ability to contribute to work, society, and the world. It transforms how people experience us, relate to us, and most important, remember us. We are no longer remembered as vibrant and engaged, but as feeble, ineffectual, even pathetic. And one other passage, in the early part of the 20th century, life expectancy increased as vaccines, antibiotics, and better medical care saved more children from premature death and effectively treated infections. Once cured, people who had been sick largely returned to their normal, healthy lives without residual disabilities. Since 1960, however, increases in longevity have been achieved mainly by extending the lives of people over age 60. Rather than saving more young people, we are stretching out old age. And that component, definitely, I'm on the same page with Emanuel in noting that this extension of the time people are managing the comorbidities of late life is not a desirable state of affairs. But he does not address the aspirations of rate control and what translational gerontology may offer in helping us redress some of these problems. Instead, what he suggests is that people should not be so obsessed with pursuing lifestyle modifications that can extend the duration of life. And he himself claims that once he reaches age 75, he will not be undergoing medical treatment to prolong his life. Emanuel notes Sir William Osler's statement in the Principles and Practice of Medicine from 1912 that pneumonia can be called a friend of the aged, providing an acute short death compared to the cold gradations of decay. Now, my reaction to Emanuel's position is mixed. As I mentioned, he's a very accomplished bioethicist, but I think in particular on this issue, his argumentation comes up well short. I think it's ageist and ableist, but I also think it's easy for one to make that argument when they're in their 50s. At the time that he was writing this, I believe he was 57, and it's somewhat haughty and myopic for a healthy 57-year-old to make proclamations that they wouldn't have any interest in extending their life beyond age 75, right? If he had been over 75 when the COVID-19 pandemic had occurred, I wonder if he would have forfeited, the vaccinations and followed his advice that dying a short death from infectious disease mortality was preferable to surviving for a few more years after the vaccination. I suspect he wouldn't have that view. So I do think there is some insensitivity when somebody is conjecturing about what their priorities might be when they're older. When he, hopefully he does, he reaches the age 75 and beyond, maybe there's grandchildren, he's continuing his academic research, but he has many things that he sees as still worth living for, and so he would have an interest in extending the duration of life, even if the onset of the comorbidities of late life may be eroding some of his self-perception about who he is and some quality of life issues. But in particular, what I don't like, and this is more the headline than the actual argumentation, picking the chronological age of 75 as representing some kind of turning point where quality of life is extinguished is deeply problematic and ageist and ableist, right? So I really don't like this idea of conflating chronological age with markers of biological aging. There are some people that survive beyond age 75 biologically much younger. And conversely, there are some people that are biologically already age 75 while they're still in their 60s. So I don't believe the essay helps. It certainly got a lot of provocative responses at the time, which I guess was its intention. But I don't think it's helped our discussions about how to address the challenges of population aging. So my conclusion, in contrast to the proposal that Emmanuel suggests, rather than pursue his stance of refusing medical treatment to increase survival time, I mean, he's articulating his own personal perspective. So in that respect, I have no problem with him pursuing that. But because he's a very prominent bioethicist, there's also this, we should emulate those that have the wisdom of understanding what medical science can deliver. And I believe it would be a mistake to think that we should all adopt a similar view and see 75 as the age where we stop visiting physicians and undergoing scans and getting medical treatment. And also, he also is very critical of the obsession with lifestyle changes. Again, I partially am sympathetic to that critique, but I also believe his criticism is not defensible. Wisdom in career longevity science should instead prioritize innovation in the pharmacological arm of rate control, something that has only become a feasible aspiration for medical science and drug innovation, thanks to very recent discoveries. So in part, the 12-year lag between my argument now and when Emmanuel was articulating his stance, a lot has changed. So maybe in part, he would change his view now if the prospect of drug development to increase health span was available. I suspect that he would have an interest in rather than simply delaying mortality until later life. And so I, in particular, emphasize the drug innovation because I agree with him that the obsession with lifestyle changes among some proponents of longevity science is both unrealistic in that most people won't be able to comply with some of these measures, but also that, when you take a holistic view of a good life for many people, maximal healthy longevity through all environmental interventions and lifestyle changes you could possibly undergo is not going to be particularly attractive. And that's why I think the drug innovation route is going to be a necessary but not sufficient route to pursue to realize healthy longevity. All right, so to go back to this juxtaposition, then I think the prospect of pursuing the war against disease erodes the realization of a good death. This is kind of why we're in the predicament that we're in, where there's a big disparity between lifespan and health span. And if we steer the steamship of modern public health more towards the realization of healthy longevity rather than just increasing survival time, I think we will have better opportunities for realizing a good death. And that is going to be the focus of the video that will follow this one. Can rate control help with the realization of a good death? And there I will suggest that there's an empirical basis for believing that this could help us better succeed in realizing a good death. And I will also have some comments about medical assisted dying, which follows on from the Emmanuel piece as well.